October 19th, 1987. A quiet Monday morning just outside Jakarta. Thousands of people are doing what they do every day, squeezing onto crowded trains, heading to work, to school, to the city. Most of them have no idea that within the hour, two of those trains will meet head-on on a single track in the woods of Bintaro. By the time it's over, more than 150 people will be dead. It will become the worst railway disaster in Indonesian history, and nearly 40 years later, it still is. This is the story of the Bintaro Tragedy. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what Indonesian railways looked like in the 1980s. Bintaro wasn't yet the busy suburb it is today. Back then, it was mostly woodland, quiet, green, southwest of downtown Jakarta. Running through it was a railway line first built in 1900 under Dutch colonial rule. By 1987, parts of that line were still single-tracked. One rail, trains traveling in both directions had to take turns sharing it, and here's the critical part. Along this stretch, there was no radio communication between trains, no modern signaling system. If two stations needed to coordinate which train went where, they did it the old way, by telephone. One call, one human being trusting another human being on the other end of the line. It was a system that worked right up until the moment it didn't. That morning, two trains were on a collision course, though nobody knew it yet. The first was KA220, an express service heading south out of Jakarta toward Rangkasbitung, carrying around 500 passengers. Coming the other way was KA225, a northbound service heading into the capital, and because it was an early morning commuter train into the city, it was dangerously overcrowded, carrying an estimated 700 people. But that number doesn't tell the whole story, because in Indonesia at the time, there was a deadly habit, one that still exists today. It's called train surfing. When people couldn't fit inside a packed train, they climbed onto the roof. They hung off the sides. Some clung to the front of the locomotive itself, riding inches above the rails just to get to work. KA225 was covered in them. Passengers on the roof, passengers wrapped around the engine. Remember that detail because it's about to matter more than anything else. The chain of failure began at a station called Sudimara. By 6:45 that morning, Sudimara was full. All three of its tracks were occupied. A train from Jakarta on one, parked freight cars on another, and now a third train pulling in. Here was the problem. KA225, the overcrowded northbound train, was supposed to wait and pass the southbound KA220 at Sudimara. But with every track taken, that was now physically impossible. The two trains could not pass each other here. The dispatcher at Sudimara realized the danger. He picked up the phone and called the next station up the line, Kebayoran, trying to arrange for the southbound train to wait there instead so the trains could pass safely. But it was already too late. By 6:45, KA220 had already left Kebayoran. It was on the single track, heading straight towards Sudimara. And now KA225 was about to make the same mistake. At Sudimara, a station worker stood on the platform with a signal lantern, signaling the northbound train's driver, "Wait, do not depart." But to his horror, the train began to move. Why? Because of the people. The driver of KA225 later explained that he couldn't even see the signal. The outside of his locomotive was so packed with train surfers that his view was completely blocked. So he asked the passengers clinging to the front of his engine what the signal said. They told him he was cleared to go. So he went. The station erupted in panic. A second worker ran out waving a red flag and another lantern, trying to stop the departing train. It didn't work. As a last, desperate measure, the dispatcher sent yet another man chasing the train on a motorbike, trying to physically catch up to a locomotive and flag it down. He couldn't catch it. Now there were two trains, one single track, both moving toward each other. The line through the Bintaro woods was curved and the trees grew thick along the rails. Visibility was almost nothing. The northbound KA225 was doing about 45 kilometers an hour. The southbound KA220 about 25. Both drivers saw the other train only seconds before impact, far too late. They slammed on the emergency brakes, but there was no time, no distance. The driver of the northbound train threw himself off the locomotive at the last possible second. The other driver dove to the ground. At 7:05 a.m., the two trains collided head-on. The locomotives took the full force, but it was the people, the ones riding on the outside, who suffered the worst. Passengers clinging to the front and roof of KA225 were thrown forward, crushed between the colliding machines or hurled to the ground. The leading carriage of the northbound train was driven completely over its own locomotive, folding around it like a sleeve, destroying everything and everyone inside, and sweeping away anyone still hanging onto the engine. When the noise finally stopped, the silence was worse. The official death toll is most often given as 153. Different sources record between 139 and 156. At least 254 more were injured. Most of the dead had been riding on the outside of the trains. Both drivers survived, the northbound driver badly hurt from his desperate leap. Rescuers worked for hours trying to free victims trapped between the crushed carriages. The images of the wreckage, broadcast on television and printed in newspapers, stunned the entire nation. The investigation was, in a way, simple. With no radio system and no modern signaling, human error was almost inevitable. Neither train had proper permission to be on that track. The exact reason the southbound train left Kebayoran was never fully explained. 4 men were eventually put on trial, both drivers, a conductor, and a dispatcher, all convicted of negligence causing death. The driver of KA225 received the harshest sentence, 5 years in prison. He insisted to the end that he acted on the only information he had, the word of passengers, blocking his view. He lost his job. He was denied his pension despite more than 20 years of service. Decades later, a journalist found him in his hometown in his 70s, selling cigarettes to survive. He was still angry, and he said he was still haunted by the final moments of that train. The Bintaro tragedy changed Indonesian railways forever. Radios were installed on all trains so drivers and dispatchers could finally talk to one another directly. The line received a modern signaling system. And in 2007, the single track that made the disaster possible was finally doubled, so trains heading in opposite directions would never again share the same rail. But one problem refused to die: train surfing. For years, authorities tried everything to stop people riding on the roofs. Police dragged them off and were pelted with stones. They tried songs, guard dogs, oil, barbed wire, even spraying riders with red paint. At one station, they hung heavy concrete balls over the tracks, just inches above the train roofs, to physically knock surfers off. Slowly, with modern trains and better enforcement, the practice has faded, but it took years and far too many lives. The Bintaro tragedy remains the deadliest railway accident in Indonesian history, a disaster born not from one dramatic failure, but from a chain of small ones: a missing radio, an overcrowded train, a blocked line of sight, a single phone call that came too late. 153 lives lost on a quiet Monday morning on a single track in the woods of Bintaro.